Always lead off. All right, welcome to the Black Games Archive, and we're excited to talk about analog games and the addition to analog games into the archive. And so I'm gonna let all of us introduce ourselves because I'm not gonna do that. But I'm TreaAndrea Russworm at University of Southern California. I'm also known as the Professor of Fun. And with me, we have
Go ahead,
Um,
Aaron.
yeah, I'm Aaron Trammell, Associate Professor of Games and UC Irvine. I'm really excited to talk to everybody about analog games today and get into some tabletop, some crunch.
I love the way Trey, in her introduction, said, I'm also known as the Professor is Fun, known as the Professor of Fun by herself.
and the rest of the world.
I'm always going to tease you about that. I'm just joking, Trey. So, my name is Samantha Blackmon. I'm an associate professor at Purdue University, where I teach, think about, research, talk a whole lot about game theory and game design.
Okay, so like the digital game side of the archive, we're going to have a discussion about the games that are included. And I always like to preface this by saying the goal of the archive is to just document Black innovation, Black cultural influences in games in the play space, period, right? So our goal with developing a taxonomy is never to be gatekeepers or to kind of have these weird exclusionary logics or anything like that. And in fact, we see this as live kind of living documentation that is always ripe for change. But we do need somewhere to start in thinking about what to include. Otherwise, we will not have easy jobs. And this is not an easy job anyway, but we intend these criteria to be talking points, right? And to be flexible and to change when it's clear that we should. So right off the bat, I always want to say that folks should use our feedback form on the website to make other suggestions of games, other suggestions for the taxonomy itself. This is definitely intended to be a conversation. So, in trying to tackle this question of what is a Black game or what is a Black analog game, I think that for my stakes, it's a lot more interesting to talk about where Blackness intersects with the medium, right? Because that is sort of broader territory, and thinking about innovation and engagement and really trying to resist essentializing. And, again, because you may think of Blackness as something that is a floating signifier, right? That shifts and changes depending on the context and the people and the history. So this taxonomy is meant as a way of continuing to kind of broaden our understanding of the history of games. And in that regard, we have all of these ways of trying to think about this, right? So when we say what should be here, what kinds of games do we want in the archive that are analog games? I'm going to go through this criteria, but then we're going to talk about it as we look at specific games. So in the digital game side, we had development. But I think there is some rich commentary or conversation to be had around how development resonates in analog games and what the role of designers, and how that term might be more applicable. Or maybe we need both terms, right? So thinking of development and designers, voice acting is obviously something that related to the video game side of things and may not relate at all in this space. But mechanics certainly does, narrative themes, politics, ideology, kind of like the political orientation of the work, whether or not they're playable Black characters or Black non-playable characters in the world, the extent to which intersectionality shows up and helps characterize the different people we experience in those spaces. And then there are also Black cultural traditions, like different music traditions, different regional Black cultural traditions, right? That's going to definitely depend on who you're talking about, where and when. Character customization no, or character creation systems, but in analog games, it may be character design, like character design or character sheets. Then we have the fandom side of things, where there's the community reception of a particular work, and maybe there's a big or large Black discourse community around a particular game. And then we have cultural mods, and certainly you can mod, you can hack. There's a house rules or a thing. You can mod analog games. And then finally, we also note anti-Blackness or regressive characterizations, things that stand out as particularly problematic. And we like to have a way of indexing that as well, because you may have some of these other things going on, but you also might have that as sort of a feature or a conceit of the project. So let's move into it. We're just going to kind of go through a couple of these and talk about some of the new games that are appearing in the analog games. So this question, Aaron, I'm going to throw this to you to kind of help us think through what development, like how do these terms resonate, development and designers, when we think of the analog space?
Yeah, so this is super duper important difference. And this is something that came up, I think, when we were trying to figure out where the games fit in the taxonomy, because as someone who researches this stuff, the very first thing I thought of was like, where are the Black designers? Because that in the world of tabletop games and board games is a big way that people find the games they play. There are studios, but often it's the designer's name that gets big top billing in the front of the book or the box. And so thinking through designers and what designers are doing is really a big part about understanding tabletop and analog games. Development also has a sort of maybe slightly different connotation. Developers in the tabletop game scene tend to be a kind of like a second designer who goes in and then play tests the game over and over to refine it and to take off the loose edges, the sort of pointy edges on the sides. And so, for example, we've got one game on the list that's coming into the archive, Android Netrunner, which is a game that Richard Garfield, the guy who designed Magic the Gathering, designed. Not a Black designer at all, but when Android Netrunner came on the scene, basically it was developed by a man named, sorry, it's got my notes, Damon Stone, and he developed a ton of expansions in the modern era of Netrunner for it. So he was really responsible for spearheading a lot of what happened with Netrunner in the years after the sort of core game rules got put down. So we think that's a really significant contribution to the world of Black gaming. And so recognizing that a developer can have just as big a hand as a designer in the tabletop scene is important for us too.
Mm-hmm. And maybe if developers are people, because when we originally thought of this, we thought of development as a process. And in video games, there are so many people. You might have narrative designers, sound designers, and what we have said is if you worked on a game and you're a Black person and you want it in this archive, you should tell us about it, mention it, you fill out the form, because that development process isn't really entirely transparent, right? Who did what on a given title gets more difficult to track in the video game space. But maybe in this case, we need developer and designers, because they're individual people who could work on either side of that might be relevant, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, and I think that what you just pointed out is the huge difference is that when we start talking about tabletop games, the largest development teams or the largest design teams are on scale with maybe a mid-sized indie studio. Mm-hmm. You often have one designer and one developer making a game and maybe an artist. And so the sort of like list of people really contributing to what is that game at the end of the day is far smaller with a tabletop game, and the profit margins are too. They make a lot less money, and that's one of the reasons that they haven't boomed. So go back into the 1980s, look at the sort of development teams you'd see on games back then for PC, and you're starting to get close to where the tabletop industry is at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I think another term we talked about was artists, right? So the art style might also be, that's obviously a lead a lead role in the development of analog games. So, maybe also the sort of visual artist is important.
Yeah, absolutely. The visual artist is super important. A publisher with an analog game is thinking through like, how does the game look? And so by making a sort of conscientious decision to recruit like a Black artist or an artist who specializes in Black culture, they're making a conscientious decision to not be one of the like thousands and thousands of games that are more likely to represent an animal on the cover than a Black person. So, which we've found is actually statistically true, unfortunately, in the tabletop space.
So I love the idea of developer, designer, artists as categories that help us add some nuance to development in analog games. Those three.
Absolutely.
Okay. Perfect. And next up, we have mechanics, which I'm excited to talk about only because I have the beautiful Harlem Unbound. I've not played it, however, but I've listened to people talk about it kind of extensively. And I don't know if you have any context for this game, Aaron, that you want to share. But it seems to me that this is one of the games that's kind of like our we started out with Mafia 3 as a featured game for the analog space or for the digital game space. And Mafia 3 was important because it hit on so many aspects of the taxonomy, right, that was just represented in this work. And I'm venturing to say Harlem Unbound is going to have the same thing here, where there's so many aspects of Black life, Black culture, Black history that are represented here, as well as the development side of things or the development process side of things. So I'm excited in that sense that we already have one of these like games that is going to work in all these directions.
Yeah, it's a beautiful game. Chris Spivey, the author of this game, has won a ton of awards for it, and it's really taking the sort of Lovecraft mythos and in a sort of like Lovecraft County kind of way, trying to undermine it from within, trying to reclaim it for Black culture, and trying to use it to drum up difficult conversations around Black culture. There's an awesome, like sort of pop-out box in the introduction that it exclaims in the front like this. I opened the book, I was like, oh my God, not another Lovecraft thing. And then I was so happy on page 7, it's like Lovecraft was a racist. I'm like, okay, they're just calling it as it is. And in that, they go on talking about how Robert E. Howard, a white supremacist, author of the Conan books, thought Lovecraft was too racist for him. But I love this line. He says, we can't change the past, but we can tear it down and rebuild it into something that focuses on bringing us together. This can only be done by facing ugly truths. And so in this sort of retelling of the sort of tried out played out Cthulhu story that we've heard over and over and over and over again, this one takes place in Harlem. It has to do with Black life. It has to do with Black everyday life in Harlem. There's things like racial tension modifiers. And so not only is the sort of supernatural mythos of like Cthulhu present in the world, but also is the very sort of like mundane presence of things like the Klan and white supremacist cops and the sort of things that Black people have to navigate in their day-to-day lives. And I think it's trying in this sort of like cauldron of elements to kind of brew up this sort of idea that while Lovecraft may have been scared of like the unknown, the otherworldly, and of course Black people, when you undermine that story and when you reverse it, you find a hero and a narrative where the Black people in the story have a lot of other things to be concerned about that aren't necessarily tentacles coming through the floors.
I love the inclusion of Harlem Unbound and games like Harlem Unbound, right? Into the archive, because I'm on the fence with the the thought of like these Black craftian retellings, right? Because I mean, yeah, because that's the whole thing is like we take something that's racist, and we repurpose it, reappropriate it, and change it, to be more inclusive. And I understand like how that works theoretically, but I'm always, you know, of the mind, of the mind in the vein of Audre Lorde, that the master's tools can't be used to dismantle the master's house, right? When we start talking about what exists as the foundation of this thing. And Harlem Unbound is something I have not played, but I am intrigued. I am intrigued. I've heard of the game before. I've seen the game before. And because I am always on the fence with Black craftian retellings, even with stuff like Lovecraft Country, like Lovecraft County or Country, I always forget. But so I'm gonna play it. I'm gonna play it. And we're gonna have to talk about this. I think we should all three of us, if we haven't played it yet. I don't know if you played it, Aaron, but I know Trey has it. So if we should all play it, and then we should come back, we should talk about this.
Oh, that'd be great.
I am, like I said, I'm really on the fence. And it's not just about this game, but it is about all Black craftian media, right? Because it's what people like. People are like, we're gonna retell Lovecraft, and we're gonna call it Black craftian. And so I'm down for that because it's an actual thing. So I'm asking y'all to play. I'm asking y'all to take me there. We're gonna play through this together.
Well, and even if it fails, I think it's important as a piece of media that's trying to do something, it's trying to begin that conversation.
100%.
It's trying to say like, well, maybe there's something wrong here, and maybe it's not revolutionary, but maybe it's a step forward, at least in the context that the game is embedded.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the beauty of the archive. And Trey and I have talked about this a bunch of times, is that there's no one way for a thing to be Black, right? And I think that there is beauty in that dissent, especially when it brings up these fruitful conversations, because it's not unusual. Trey and I disagree on stuff a lot of times when we start talking about blackness in games. But I think that there's beauty in that dissent and in that conversation, right? Because they're in the same way that there is no one way for a game to be Black. There's no one way for a person to be Black, right? So this defining of Blackness is definitely always an active thing.
Yeah, what I appreciate about this as just a book is how expansive it is in thinking about all these different aspects of Black history and culture. So I mean, you have literature, you have, because it's about the Harlem Renaissance, music. Right? So you have music, you have like a recount of the effects of Black migration, of the Great Migration. And so you're really thinking about all these different aspects of Black culture and Black history. And that comes down, that also influences how I imagine, how you play these different scenarios. So that the book has, pages and pages of all these different types of scenarios. But when we think about mechanics, it's kind of like you probably are going to be mechanically significant if your context is registering in this direction or all these directions, right? That there's no way that you can do things within that space, within that scene, that isn't going to be mechanically significant. So I like that. And it, to me, feels like a completely different, in every level, in every way, context, right? Well, where is the Lovecraft? I mean, I don't know the source material well enough, but when I look at this, like, I don't even know where to pinpoint, its source material. Maybe it's in the monsters, or because like the mechanics, for example, the skills and the stats, are so thoughtfully done. Like we know that typically Black characters have these like outrageously racist like stats, like resistant to fire. I'm thinking of Skyrim, or has a way with animals and nature. That there are ways that stuff is hardwired right into the mechanics, because numerically there is a representation of that racism. And here, even at that level, of course, that's all reconstructed and reconsidered. So again, as someone who hasn't played this but is really excited about it, I'm like, I don't even know where to begin to find the original inspiration, because it seems like such a significant departure.
Yeah, well, it's in there. It's in a lot of the story design also, because they have scenarios that you play through, narratives that walk you through things. And so, it's playing into that, but the whiteness in the game is very much that unknown that you're playing up and into against it. And so it's playing a little into that trope where it's not the seeping spread of blackness that the player should be fearful of, which is, I think, the Lovecraftian trope, as much as it's the pervasive institutional whiteness that you're up against in a variety of ways in this game, being sometimes also embodied by the otherworldly.
Right on. Well, I'm going to look into some of the playthroughs of it too. So there's some really good ones out there on YouTube. Okay, so also for mechanics, there may be places to look, in the analog space. They're even much more straightforward too, right? Than that, where you have rap gods and, presumably you are battling. I'm not entirely sure, but presumably this is touching on all of these different elements of hip hop. And so you can have mechanics that are a little less abstract than other contexts. But abstraction is one thing I wanted to talk about too, Aaron, because I think that might be an aspect of analog games that is going to be even more influential in these discussions and considerations.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a big conversation. So just with Rap Gods, just to mention that I think you're a record producer and you're trying to produce the next big album, and so you're vying with the other record producers.
Okay.
But yeah, there's the story of tabletop games and abstraction is one that's kind of been messed up since Jump. You've got, like games like Catan, where you're settling this island. So immediately, right, like the Settlers of Catan, the hit tabletop game from Germany that like caused this sort of like new wave of tabletop games this past 30 years to come around, is immediately the context of colonialism is within it and invisible from the start. And things only get worse with games like Puerto Rico, which was for a very long time celebrated as one of the greatest tabletop games ever. And in this game, you'd put little small brown cylinders onto ships, onto slave ships, and then onto plantations. That was an actual mechanic of the game that you'd be using. So you've got this kind of colonialist mindset when it comes to abstraction that's really been part of the tabletop games history. And also within the community and culture, you had a community where people were saying, well, it's just a game, it's just fun, who cares what you're doing with these things, it's just a brown token, what's the big deal? And so there's this really kind of poisoned culture that kind of persisted for years and years around representation in tabletop games. And I say this all just to point out that when you get someone like Omari Akil making a game like Rap Gods or Hoop Gods, it's kind of a triumph just to see that game in this space, because there has been a comprehensive community effort to not allow games by Black designers, games that allow for I wouldn't even say radical Black ideas, but just like Black culture overall to exist in that space when it's not, abstracted into a sort of context of settler colonialism. And so I think it's really amazing to see any kind of games that are portraying Black people in the tabletop space in a really positive way.
So that's interesting, Aaron, because like you just like hit three things for me, right? So I mean, and again, and your faves are problematic, right? Catan is the one I always make jokes about. I'm like, oh, it's the colonialism simulator, but at the same time, it's a game that I always enjoy playing, right? But I recognize what it is, right? I recognize it for what it is. And then when you talk about Puerto Rico, I remember the first time I played Puerto Rico. We have a video game, not video game, an analog game, board game cafe here in town. So you can go in and you can like pay for a certain number of hours and play any game that you want. And the owner was an ex-teacher, so we would like chat all the time. And when he got Puerto Rico, he brought it over. He was like, we have to play this game with me. And we started to play this game, and I was like, yo, why you bring this slave simulator over here? And he had never thought about it, right? So we sat there and we talked about it for like an hour, and it was hilarious because it was like you said, it was the hot game, right? And everybody was like, this is the best analog game ever. So and we had that conversation because coming from different worldviews, he had never thought about it in that way. But I think it's interesting to have to and be able to talk about that. And so when we see these kinds of things and the ways that people pick up on things, I remember being at GDC, I was at GDC, I can't even remember what year it was like 500 years ago at this point. And Brenda Romero was playtesting Train. And she's like, come play this game. And I'm like, all right, let's play this game. So I sat down and I'm sitting down, I'm playing this game with a bunch of white dudes. And as we start to play through and we start to go through and do stuff, right? And it started to become a question of how much will you do, right? And as we were playing, I went, no. And she looked at me because she didn't tell us what the game was about. She's like, here's the rules, right? So she wanted to see how long it took people to pick up on what the hell was going on in that game. And she was like, and at a point I was like, no. And she's like, what is it? I'm like, I'm out. I'm not doing this. And of course, like I said, playing with a bunch of white dudes, and they were like, why? And I'm like, you don't see what's going on here. I mean, so when you start talking about things like putting brown pegs on slave ships, when you start talking about putting people on trains to concentration camps and not having a specific kind of worldview or not being able to kind of see what's going on based on your knowledge of history and historical occurrences, I think that's why these conversations are so important, even when we do find that they're problematic.
I have Freedom, the Underground Railroad game up here because it's transitioning us into talking about narrative themes and context, but it's also literally about slavery and slave trade. And so there are times when I think the narrative side of things is going to be spot on, but I think we were also thinking in terms of allegory, right? Or just a theme, and there might be some resonance with Black culture, traditions, or experiences that are not as literal as this even. So this is another example when we think about narrative, but then you also just thematically have games that may be relevant in this context that are not narrative games, right? That these are, again, the Black Card Revoked game, is getting at all of these different aspects of Black vernacular life that are going to show up in that space. And then there is this sort of culture around that it's not narratively represented, but thematically, yes, there's resonance.
Yeah, no, this one's funny because you get your Black Card revoked when you can't answer the question. When you play the game through until you can't answer the question, and then you're not Black enough for the rest of the table.
Right, which is maybe a fun way at it's a sort of, there's no harm intended, but it does get me thinking about authentic claims to authenticity too, right? Like, what is authentically Black? And we know that that's super loaded, but I've seen people play this on like BuzzFeed or so, playing this game, and it is quite funny. So there is that as well. And then there's sort of a political orientation that we were going for with just thinking about the ideological focus or thrust of a game. And Block by Block is a game that I have and haven't played yet, but it is about an uprising. It is about, sort of overthrowing sort of police state. And even thematically, so even if there's not a literal representation of Blackness in that space, thematically and ideologically, there may be some relevance there, and again, if that's the only designation, right, when we go back to looking at the broader view of the taxonomy, I would say, well, maybe not included, or maybe there is a strong case to make for a game that allegorically, or at least in terms of its politics, seem like, hey, it fits in this conversation. But I would also be interested to see like what else in a project like this might resonate, or whether designers or developers, for example, that participated, or artists, in the space.
Yeah, and I love where you're going with this, that it's not just about representations of Black culture, but also representations of shared struggle and solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a really important conversation to be having. Solidarity with others who are oppressed, have been oppressed, is an important part of Black history that I'm glad that we're acknowledging in the archive.
Yeah, and it'll relate to intersectionality too, as a possibility for thinking about inclusion. Black playable characters seems pretty straightforward, and that's Hoop Gods, right? Do you know are you playing as a player or as a manager in this one as well? I love
I
the
haven't
art for
played
both of these; they're awesome.
I haven't played this one, but I think you are a player
Okay.
in this one.
Yep. So that's possible there too. And then also, obviously, just sort of like games, like role-playing games in both space, in the analog space and in the digital game space. Who you are, who you play as, is really obviously going to be dependent on who you create and who you imagine. So there's some flexibility, or there's an elastic nature to this categorization, especially when you're thinking about role-playing games, because it's hard to say, right? But typically, how are people playing, and does it allow you to be a playable Black character? I think is a good question.
Or does it force you to? One game that I think we're adding is Steal Away Jordan, Stories from America's Peculiar Tradition. And it's kind of a role-playing game version of Toni Morrison's Beloved. And you are a slave on a plantation. The game you might be playing is like, how do I escape? It might be, how do I get shoes? Right. Like, it might be very mundane. It's this really beautiful game. The designer's name is Julia Bond Ellingbo. And it's also fascinating insofar as how it challenges people. Lots of white players who go into the game will say, like, I can't play this game. I don't feel comfortable playing this game. I don't feel comfortable having the story. And it's kind of tricky there, because like on the one hand, well, maybe that cultural tourism, it's good that you don't want to be enjoying that moment of cultural tourism. At the same time, the design of the game is intended to bring people into that space and make them experience this sort of awful part of Black history. And so putting people there and challenging them with that, I think, is one of the goals of the game. And so you see that also with some design around Black characters in tabletop games.
What's the name of that game again?
Steal Away Jordan.
Steal Away Jordan. Okay, well, here we have it on the next slide.
There we go.
Thinking about Black playable characters and Black NPCs as well. So yeah, another one for me to check out. This is awesome. I mean, it's really educational, right? That we imagine that people in the archive may have some proficiency or, involvement on one side or the other, but obviously the games are games, and there's often a lot of movement where you'll have people play video games, but they also play analog tabletop games. And the idea is to try to have all of this in conversation and intention, and make it give us a more complex view of, Black culture and Black participation in games, period. So I think it's healthy to use this archive and then find things that, hey, I didn't even know this existed. Let me try it. And in my case, for personal selfish reasons, I'm like soaking all of this in on the analog side of, thank goodness, there are more things to play that won't have me at my computer or at my television that I can actually step away from the sort of digital side of things for a while. Intersectionality has come up a little, but obviously being able to think about race, gender, ability, class, queerness, nationality, the Black diaspora, global Black identities, and also all of those, Aaron, you said it, those other struggles and fights and movements that, where there's room and there has been intentionality around coalition building and allyship, right? So being able to think about all of that more richly and dynamically. And there's definitely games out there and experiences that invite that and are more open to that than not.
Yeah. And I would just, this collection is amazing in a lot of different ways. One of the editors of this collection is Misha Buschjager. I think we'll talk about her more in a moment when we talk about community building. But she was one of the editors of this collection, along with a few other awesome people. And there's just an amazing group of Black designers, featured in here. Joanna Kemper, Lisa Simpson. Is it Lisa? Sorry, Laura Simpson, not Lisa. That's on me. Laura Simpson, these amazing designers who have gone out of their way not only to talk about Black identity in the games that they designed here, but also talk about feminism and to try to think about the two together in a productive way, which I always think is, the heart and soul of intersectionality, and why when we talk about intersectionality, we're not talking about multiculturalism. It's not just add more women, add more Black people, and you've got intersectionality. It's a more complicated conversation about ideals and coalitions. So I think this collection just does it beautifully.
Can I ask about the materiality of this collection? Is it like a book like Harlem Unbound, and they're different, each game is sort of collected in that sense? Or are there physical like objects that are related to each? What's the format for them?
Yeah, so it is a book like Harlem Unbound, and this genre of game is called micro LARPs, where it's that's why they call it a nano game collection. They're role-playing games that fit on like 2 or 3 pages. So you can open the book up, you can read the 2 or 3 pages, and then how to basically run this game in your living room with like a small group of friends. And that's the real spirit behind the collection.
I think it's, well, you know what? I think it's only in the analog space where games can also be books, right? I mean, we used to have, there is no sort of book format. This is just a sort of side connection, that we used to have like game manuals and strategy guides used to be a thing, but like all of that is mostly digitized now, and I kind of am excited when there is a sort of physicality to the experience, whether it's PDFs that's all collected together or actual physical book, and now I can have those games kind of represented in the sort of literary crevices of my life as well. So that's
I love it. One of my favorite things is watching YouTube videos of people opening up old PC games and like going through like the copyright code protection materials and the maps and stuff that they used to put in the boxes. It was so cool.
I just taught The Sims original game from 2000, and it had a 90-page game manual that was like nothing else. I mean, it had like a syllabus at the end, basically. It had a reading list and all of this stuff, role-playing moments of like, hey, I'm going to be this character and I'm going to engage with your imaginary like sim neighborhood. And so it was just a whole experience materially that you had that was unique to that time. So.
Well, that was always that was a big part of the fun. It's like the hours that you literally spent going through all of the material before you even like installed the game. Yeah.
I wish games would get back to that. I miss it.
I think it was cut mixed for just financial reasons, but it's but I love to see the analog games like that. That's an anchor, you know, in the presentation and the circulation of the games.
Yeah, 1000%.
So Black cultural traditions, we can talk about how that is, you know, part of all of these different games. And then we have certain games that circulate in a Black cultural context, like spades, or we talked about Uno, Bid Whiz. Like you can think about games that have a particular kind of, they're special in Black cultural life. And where again, it's not that, oh, if you didn't have these, or dominoes, for example, right? Like these are games that anybody can play. But then again, regionally, like I remember when I was in college, I was like my senior year of college, I went to the summer program, and it was, you know, for all people of color. And we had these guys from Morehouse, and somehow every night we had like spades tournaments. It was kind of like this ongoing thing, and it was intense and it was cool. And you know, every space had its own rules, right? Like you know, sort of the house rule system, which I'm kind of getting into a little bit when it comes to the fan culture. But suffice to say that these are titles, these are games that travel different Black cultural spaces as well. And I think are kind of have a sort of over determined or strongly determined position in like Black leisure culture and play culture.
And we need more people to think about this, share those traditions, those stories, because I think that's the tricky thing with these games, right? Like is there's no credits, they're folk games, and so we only know them through storytelling and the sort of cultural traditions that they exist through. So documenting that's really important, and finding documents of that's really important.
They also loom large on Black Twitter. So like, you know, hashtag spades or hashtag there were a whole bunch around Uno. And I think the manufacturers like issued at some point
They did.
Yeah, and they issued a statement about house rules that was obviously directed at like a community of Black players, you know, saying, hey, look, this does not work this way. I don't know if it was with the reverse card or what the heck it was, but there was a lot of traction.
It was with like the reverse or the draw 3 or something, or stack and draw 3 cards or something like that. Yeah, they did they actually tweeted back like here's the official rule.
Yeah. And fans are not having that, you know, because again, how much this is circulating for how long. I will mention a special issue in the American Journal of Play called Blackness in Play, which I guess edited. We did have some interviews and articles on spades and on Uno and on a couple of games that were really important in the Black Twitter space. And so, yeah, we need more. You know, we have a few kind of like anthropological kind of archival efforts around Black games that circulate in a folk kind of tradition, but we don't have enough of that. And certainly I think opening up this archive to analog games and other kinds of games is going to be great for this, being able to document, archive this in a new way. So robust character creation system or character design system, right? So, you know, maybe there are in the game space, you might have the digital renderings of a character that you're creating, but here you might have character sheets, right? You might have just the whole role-playing scene in general adds new dimension to the concept of creating your own characters to be in these spaces.
Yeah, and I think the conversation here in tabletop games has always been a little different than in digital games, because the apparatus to imagine yourself as a character from almost any race has always been there, especially if you're open to house rules or like, you know, letting your players identify however they want with a lot of role-playing games. Whereas like in digital games, we've had to create like, you know, character creators, these slider systems and stuff like that to create better and more robust representation. So I think the conversation here is slightly different because it is one that's about stats and like what the character looks like. but it's also about how that character interacts with the world. Like what are the stakes of the world? Is this a racist world? Is this a world where we just assume racism is that? And is that being handled in a critical way, like it is maybe in Harlem Unbound, or is it a completely uncritical way, like it has been in Dungeons and Dragons for years and years and years, where there was even like a racial prejudice table at one point to help characters like understand how racist your character should be about like the dwarves or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think this sort of like imagining of race, and especially imagining of racism within games, is a place where tabletop games, you really see the sort of character creation process having always been in the driver's seat, kind of taking a jump forward and thinking about how those characters interact with the world and what the stakes of the world are.
And I'm curious about Dungeons and Dragons in particular, Aaron. Is that going to show up as one of your suggestions anytime soon?
Is that a
I know
joke?
you're an
like,
expert in
what?
this topic in Dungeons and Dragons, and so I could see a case for it from my vantage point, my small corner of the universe. But I wonder, what do we think?
I mean,
didn't we say if I'm sorry, I'm gonna let you do this, Aaron.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of things on it. So, I mean, I always like to start with things are better now than they have been in some ways. Like they in the 5th edition handbook, which is the present edition of Dungeons and Dragons, when they have the page on humans, there's a black woman next to that. That's big. That's a big important.
That is
step.
big for Dungeons and Dragons. Yes. Yeah, I was like, I'm sorry.
No, you go.
No, I was like, when Trey asked that question, I was like, I thought we agreed that if there was only regressive representation, that was a no.
Well, we're not there yet, but I don't think there's only regressive representations in Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, because here we are on the fandom and community reception page. There are players of color. There's groups of people that again kind of embrace and repurpose and kind of construct and retool D&D. There are the fandom side of it is the argument that I would make for thinking about it, but that's just because, but I don't think these are unconscious, appropriations and uses of the space. So maybe you have the regressive characterizations. You definitely have robust fan and player communities that film their, isn't Waterdeep isn't related to,
but they're not using D&D. They're using other systems.
Would you
they're
say?
They're not using Dungeons and Dragons. They're using
They're not
other
using
systems.
that system. They're using other systems. Okay.
Yeah, Rivals of Waterdeep uses a different system, I think.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're not wrong though. There is other fan action, not just not just Tanya's series. Oh no, if it's Rivals of Waterdeep, it's got to be set in Waterdeep is a Dungeons and Dragons locale. So that is Dungeons and Dragons for sure. And yeah, there is a ton of fan traction and excitement around Dungeons and Dragons right now as a sort of inclusive game. And that's definitely where a lot of people in the brand want it to go. So yeah, on the fan level, I mean, like there's sites that Wizards of the Coast has now called like the Dungeon Masters Guild, where fans can come in and create their own supplements and sell them. There's a few rules for what they can and can't do, but it's been a really constructive space where you actually see a lot of the Black designers who go on to create role-playing systems that are bigger in the tabletop space kind of cut their teeth in this sort of more fan space, scaled down intro to sort of producing tabletop games there. The flip side of it is that Wizards of the Coast as a company has a lot of trouble just getting things right. So last summer, they put out this amazing collection called Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel. It's a collection authored entirely by BIPOC people, really kind of critically and culturally celebrated as like a huge step forward for what the sort of content they would put out for Dungeons and Dragons was. And then like literally 3 months later, they put out another supplement called Spelljammer. And in Spelljammer, it was a supplement that was originally written in the 1980s. And they had like a race of minstrel-like monkey people in it. And so like of course, this like pissed everybody off
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it was completely retrograde in how it was portraying this one race of characters. Now they weren't saying they were black characters, they were actually monkeys, but like, you
Right.
know, if you were if you understand the history of this, that sort of
Yeah.
dehumanization of blackness to monkeyness
Mm-hmm.
is
Planet of the Apes.
part of
Here
the
we go.
history. Yep.
And that
And so,
connection to minstrelry, right?
yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm just going to mention the last three things here as we continue thinking about Dungeons and Dragons. Hey, look, I just asked if it's going to show up because you do have the fandom side, you have of maybe how influential it's been and departures from that structure. But then you have, you know, significant, this tradition of modding, rewriting, you have that. And then the last thing is the anti-Black and the regressive characterizations, right? Supremacist logic. So it could be that something like that is all three of these, right? That boom, you have the large fan community, you have these traditions of rewriting and retooling, departing from that to change the experience, break off or break out experiences. And then you also at the same time could have that. So just in hearing both of you, it seems like that those three things might be factors if D&D does make an appearance at some point. And then four, you know, that you are able to create characters based on who you want, how you want to see them. So boom and boom, boom. Possible. Not saying it will necessarily or be a high priority in the first couple of waves of analog games getting some attention. But, you know, we have in the digital side, we have, I think, well, I don't know if we have Stardew Valley yet, but we probably will if we don't have it up there yet. And we do have mods that totally change that experience for people if they want to have a more diverse, you know, Stardew Valley, for example.
Hey, you know, to your point, I think it belongs in the archive one day, but I think there's a lot of indie developers in the tabletop scene who will really value the fact that we're not foregrounding it as Black representation in tabletop games. Because there's so many more richer places you can go to start than Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons winds up being in tabletop world, the place that everybody goes when they don't know about all the other stuff. So I think there is a sort of activism around maybe putting it on one of the later waves, just not the first wave.
Exactly. It's like citation politics, right? You have to push forward more diverse voices and developers first before going directly to D&D. I agree.
And this brings us full circle to the first wave of things that are coming out as analog games. And that was your focus in curating this experience, Aaron, that you were primarily focused on developers, designers, artists, right? Like thinking about the people side, the labor involved, the you know, the ingenuity of folks who've been in this space, and that has been a priority in getting us going in this, right?
What 100%. And I would say this first wave is mostly on designers, but as we go deeper, developers and artists will probably be a second priority for the next wave, and then moving forward from there, probably going deeper just into representation overall, trying to plume some of those depths.
Right on. Well, this has been a great conversation for me, super insightful. I'm excited to play and experience and learn more about some of these games, but I'm also just excited to continue to grow the archive and open it up to the broader scene of Blackness in games.